Tierney from Chester, Connecticut. You are listening to ICRV Radio, the stream feeding the River Valley.
Powered by the friends of the Office of State Archaeology. Welcome everybody to Archaeology of Connecticut. And here's the State Archaeologist, Sarah Sportman.
Hi everybody. Welcome to our June episode of the Archaeology of Connecticut. I'm the Connecticut State Archaeologist, Sarah Sportman, and I'm joined tonight by my co-host, Scott Brady, President of the Friends of the Office of State Archaeology Group.
Hi everybody, how are you tonight?
And our special guest tonight, Dr. Nick Bellantoni, the Emeritus State Archaeologist of Connecticut.
Hey guys, thanks for having me back.
So due to continuing social distancing guidelines, we're all calling into the studio again this month. And given that our June show fell so close to Memorial Day this year, we thought it would be fitting to talk a little bit about some of the archaeological investigations of World War II era plane crashes that occurred in Connecticut. There were over 70 military plane crashes in the state during World War II. Most of these occurred during training or transport activities, and many, although not all of them, resulted in the deaths of young pilots. Archaeological investigations have been conducted at only a few of these sites, including two in Preston near the former Norwich State Hospital, one at what is now Bradley Airport, and one in Norfolk, Connecticut. And Nick knows a lot about all of these sites, and he's volunteered to come and talk to us about them tonight. He probably needs no introduction to most of the archaeological community here. So I'm just going to turn it over to Nick and see what we can talk about tonight about these plane crash sites.
Great. Well, these are absolutely unique in that, it brings us into a new field of archaeology, or a branch, if you will, called Aviation Archaeology, where archaeologists have explored plane crashes, much like, say, underwater archaeologists have dealt with shipwrecks and other kinds of cultural resources associated with maritime. So in this case, it's aviation. And like you said, there have been a number of actual plane crashes in the state. And in fact, we a long time ago, we contacted and worked with a guy by the name of Larry Webster, who was from Rhode Island, an aviation buff, who actually had developed a comprehensive database of plane crashes in southern New England, including much of Connecticut. And he actually went out in the field in many cases and explored them to see if there were any remnants, archaeological remnants of those crashes. And of course, we tried to tag along whenever we could, and got involved in a couple of these that hopefully we'll have time to talk to tonight. I was hoping that we could start off with the Bradley crash. Bradley International Airport, I think 7 million people a year go through that airport, and I bet you most of them don't know why it's named Bradley International Airport. And I think that'd be a good place to start, since this is, like Sarah said, so close to Memorial Day, and it's named there to honor an airman that perished out at Bradley. Yeah, well, like you say, not many people know, actually, the story of Lieutenant Eugene Bradley and what happened there. We got involved, our office got involved with this, in the early 2000s. Basically, back in 1998, the New England Air Museum published a book about the history of Bradley Airport, kind of its first 25 years. And during the research of that, many, they understood that nobody really knew where the plane crash occurred, that in fact Bradley Field is named after. And so after that, they came to us and, said, could we use archaeological techniques and methods to see if we could find the location of the crash? And I was really, happy to do it because, I love a history mystery, first of all. And to be able to use archaeological techniques to solve the problem were really excited me. So we got involved with this, and I should tell you, not only was our office involved with the search, but the Department of Transportation, the Airport Administration, local communities and corporations, the military was helping, and we worked with federal agencies like, the National
the Natural Resources Conservation Center, the Department of Agriculture. So we really had we put together a team, and part of that team was Scott's organization, that is to say the Friends of the Office of State Archaeology. They were extremely helpful. In this case, Roger Thompson, who was then president of FOSA, and Paul Scannell, who was was on the board, did really the bulk of the research along with the folks at the New England Air Museum. Anyhow, so we put together this team and developed a methodology to try to figure out where the crash may have occurred and how we might search for it. So what ended up happening is that Paul and Roger compiled all the historic documentation they could, including military records and newspaper accounts and anything they could find on the crash. And then in that search, they were able to find probably, I'm going to say, 9 or 10 individuals who were still alive and who were there in August of 1941 and had witnessed the crash. So we actually had local informants as well as historic documents, and we started to put together some factors, characteristics of the plane crash itself. So what archaeologists do, we test hypotheses, and sometimes to do that, we develop what we call test implications. If this is so, what should we see? And so we developed a series of criteria based on that research of what we should see to conform to our decisions on where the plane crash occurred and our archaeological testing of it. So we were very lucky to get the Department of Transportation's aerial photographs. They were extremely important to us. So what the Department of Transportation gave us, the Connecticut Department, is photographs, aerial photographs before the crash. Now, the crash occurred, and I'll get into what the story of the crash in a moment, but the crash occurred on August 21st, 1941. That's about 5 months before Pearl Harbor and the United States entering into the Second World War. So we got aerial photographs before the crash and then after the crash. And so what we were looking for is comparing those photographs, those images, to scars in the ground that would show up that might be indicative of the plane crash. And so combining that research with the characteristics, we came up with 6 locations that had possibilities and would eventually go out into the field and test those particular ones.
What kind of method you use to test the locations?
We did everything from physical tests like test pitting. We did trenches. We also, because we were looking for scars in the ground and material culture, and we used geophysical techniques like ground penetrating radar to help us key in, along with GPS systems and so forth. The crash, as I said, Eugene Bradley's air crash occurred on the 21st of August. The airport, or I should call it was an airfield, it was an Army air base, opened only 3 days before, on August 18th. That's when they had their, grand opening, if you will. And it opened up as an Army air base field. Bradley was part of the 64th Pursuit Squadron. They originally came up from Texas. They were at Mitchell Field in Long Island, and then transferred on August 19th up to Bradley. 2 days later is when the crash occurred. So Bradley was really only in Connecticut maybe 2 days before he died. And what happened was, as the squadron was getting settled in the area at the airport, one morning, Second Lieutenant Frank Mears goes into the ready room where the pilots were assembling, and he basically says, "Hey, anybody want to go up and do some training? We'll do some dog fights, like Top Gun type stuff." And so Bradley, who's very enthusiastic, raises his hand and says, "I'll go." And so he says, Frank says, grab your gear and let's go up. So around 2:15 in the morning, they take off. Bradley's plane went down the runway first, and Frank Mears was following him. They ascended up to about 10,000 feet, and when they got there, then they started to do these top gun dog fights, kind of trying to sweep around, trying to get each other. And Mears was able to maneuver his Curtiss P-30 plane. They were both flying Curtiss P-30s. He maneuvers around him. He gets behind Bradley and basically radios him, "Okay, I've got you. So let's do it again. Let's do another one." So the idea was they both veered to the left and were going to go back up to 10,000 feet. Now, when he got Bradley, it was probably about, they were probably about 5,000 feet up in the air at the time. So Mears veers to the left and starts to ascend. He starts going up. But when he looks out the window, he doesn't see Bradley's plane. And he kind of positions himself to look down, and he sees instead of Bradley coming up, Bradley's going down. He's in a spiral, going straight down, nose first. And he radios Bradley. He said, pull up. And there's no response at all. And finally, he yells, to Bradley, bail out. And again, no response. And the plane came down from 5,000 feet, nose first. It was making that whistle sound, that searing sound that people throughout the area could hear. And many were following it because, dogfights, military dogfights in Windsor Locks, Connecticut in 1941 was a pretty new event. And people that were working farms in Suffield and Windsor Locks and East Granby were looking up, watching them, and then saw that the plane was starting to come down nose first. Everyone expecting that it would pull up, but it was completely out of control. And Bradley hit nose first into a lightly wooded area. There was no explosion. There was no, no fireball, nothing. It was quiet once it hit. The only thing that people remember was the shake of the ground. The ground shook with the impact. And one of the people that felt that, sadly, was Eugene Bradley's wife, Anne, who was in Pequannock section of Windsor, actually making lunch, preparing lunch for her and her husband to have together when he finished his training. She felt the earth shake, but had no idea it was her husband's plane crash. And at that time, she was about 4 months pregnant with their son, who would be born later when she returned back to Texas. So if you know anything about the soil out there at Bradley, it's a very sandy, glacial soil, very soft. And when he hit the ground, it plunged into the soil, so that when the rescue teams finally got out there, his plane, the nose of his plane was down into the ground probably 12 to 13 feet. And when the rescue crews got there, the only thing that was visible was the tail of the aircraft that was still above ground. So the military went in there and they cut the area up. People came from very different directions, and because there was no fireball or smoke to guide them, many of the eyewitnesses that Paul Scannell and Roger Thompson had talked to gave kind of conflicting accounts, and we don't know if that's because they were confusing other crashes with the Bradley crash or what. But at night, I have to say all the eyewitnesses were not consistent in what they told us. And it could be the memory from 60 years ago, or it could simply be that because they saw from their perspectives, because there was no fireball, they couldn't exactly nose in on it. In fact, when the military went out to the crash sites to hopefully recover Bradley in the plane, many of them came roundabout ways because they couldn't find it until they got in closer. So the military response was they brought a bulldozer out and a wrecker and picked up literally the tail of the plane. Workers, meanwhile, were digging down 12 feet to get to the cockpit, and that's where they found Bradley. He was obviously dead and still strapped in. Nobody knows what happened. The theories are that when he veered off during the dogfight, that he must have blacked out because he never responded, never indicated anything to rescue himself. He just went down nose first into the ground. After they removed the wreckage, they filled in a crater. So what ended up happening is that there was a crater that went down 12, 13 feet. And they filled it in, the bulldozers filled it in once they removed Bradley and the airplane. So this, it's very traumatic. But knowing that, understanding how that crash occurred, gave us some ideas of what we should be looking for. This wasn't a plane crash that was coming in and a landing type of thing. This was nose first. So you're looking for a crater, literally a circular crater of dispersed soils that were then put in. And like I said, we had about 6 or so candidates, areas, and when we using overlaying maps and finding them in the field, we tested doing test pits, trenches, and what we were looking for, we used metal detecting, by the way, but what we were looking for was that crater. We're looking at mixed model soil that would have been part of that incident. And we came up blank every time, every spot we checked, whether we did it with geophysics, whether we did it with actual excavation, we could not find it. And I remember we had the team together, and I said, look, let's just take a hiatus. Let's pull away from this, go on to other projects, and let's take a look at this again maybe in about 4 or 5 months and see if something new arises. And that's what we did. And when we came back, and so the whole thing, I should tell you, this whole thing took about 3 years for us before we found it, or what we believe we found. And that's when we re-looked at the aerials, and a guy by the name of Tom Paulshaw, who was a volunteer working at the New England Air Museum, noticed another scar that we had missed in our initial looks at the aerial photographs. And we, looks like a candidate. When we triangulated it from known landmarks on all the maps, including today's maps, we found it, pinpointed it. The problem was it was under an existing runway 33. And, for archaeologists to excavate under an existing runway is not an easy thing to do. What had happened was Bradley Airport was very much involved in this, and, we were in constant communication with them through the whole process. And so when we told them that we had a hit spot under the runway, we wanted, could we use geophysical techniques to do that? Now, I should tell you that runway wasn't there in 1941. In 1961, Bradley Airport was now moving over more to civilian, or the state. The state always owned the property. They leased it to the federal government as an Army air base. But when the state took over as a civilian airport, they were now wanted to accommodate jet aircraft, and so they expanded the runways at that time, and inadvertently would go over the spot that we were very anxious to test. But Bradley Airport was very cooperative. We worked with Roland Tibbett, the manager at the airport, and what they did is they actually closed off that runway for us for 2 hours and allowed us to get out there with ground-penetrating radar. And again, we were assisted by U.S. Department of Agriculture, the Natural Resources Conservation Service. Debbie Sarabian came out with Sean McFay from their Tallinn office with their radar equipment, and we went up and down the runway, if you will. We set up a grid and went up and down the runway in the area that we had to hit. And when the data was compiled, and by the way, we were only allowed 7 people on the runway because of security issues. So we had to get in there and work quickly, but we were able to do it. And when we came back, Debbie had found 2 hotspots within that grid. One was an extremely extensive one. And when she profiled that hotspot vertically, it gave a perfect image of a crater that went down approximately 12 to 13 feet, exactly what we were looking for. And you could see in the radar image the mixed mottled soil, kind of like we use it for locating unmarked graves. We were able to, you could see the cone. You could see the cone. It was a perfect image. And now, so we're very excited, but I wanted to see the soil itself. I wanted a sample of that soil. So I went back to Bradley Airport and said, "Can we drill a core just through?" If I was looking for like a 4-inch core to go through down into that feature and collect samples of the soil. And they said, "No, we don't think we're going to have you do that on our roadway." So we said, "Okay, we understood. We couldn't do it, but I really wanted it to." Well, as I don't know if it's called luck or whatever would have it, but in 2008. When we went into the economic recession, Bradley Airport was given stimulus money to repave some of their runways. So they came to me and said, "We're going to be digging this up, and this might be an opportunity if you still want to do this." And I said, "Wonderful." So we went out there with one of these environmental big trucks, that has a drill core off the back. And we put a 4-inch core into the ground right through that feature that came up on the radar and brought up about, I would say probably about maybe not quite 2 yards of soil, but quite a bit of soil. Eventually that would be all patched up with the new runway. And we brought the soils over to the New England Air Museum where they were dumped. And our FOSA volunteers, the Friends of the Office of State Archaeology, came down and they screened. We took soil samples and so forth. We were hoping to find a number of things, one of which was any scrap metal, anything that would point to an airplane and any parts that could be identifiable as a Curtiss P-40. And it turned out we didn't really. We did find some metal, some pieces, but very small fragments. Some aluminum, which the plane was made with aluminum and iron, but nothing that it was identifiable. However, what we did was we took our soil samples and we went to the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection and had their labs that sample soils for contamination and so forth take a look at these soils. And what they found in the soil was really good traces of residuals of oil, coolant, and antifreeze. So within the soil, exactly what we would expect from a crash like that. What makes us confident is that of all the plane crashes, there were about 20 plane crashes at Bradley Field during the Second World War. But the majority of those plane crashes were, kind of in landings and getting no real nose down plunge crashes. That was Bradley's was unique with that. So we're pretty confident. However, I have to say, because we didn't find that silver bullet, there is another area that we looked at much later. In fact, Scott was out with us on that, where Roger Thompson had interviewed another soldier, actually living down in Delaware, and gave his account and put it a little bit distant, but not very far from where we got that image. And we wanted to test that, but while we were able to get out there with the radar and so forth, we really didn't cover enough area to be conclusive one way or the other. But the crater, everything we could point to seems that is off of runway 33 is the most likely spot. And I should tell you that the crash occurred in August of 1941. In January of 42, 6 months later, because Bradley was the first fatality at the airstrip, that's when it was no longer referred to as the Windsor Locks airstrip, but it was then rededicated as the Lieutenant Eugene Bradley Field. And then eventually it would become the airport and the international airport it is today. So quite a fascinating story. You know, we think of the veterans, the military people who gave their lives during combat. Okay, but many also died during training. And Bradley is a classic example of that, giving his life to his country in training, and should be, acknowledged. So one of the things that we were happy about with this project was, not only using archaeology to solve a history mystery, but also to give renewed recognition to Bradley and who he was and why the airport is in fact named Eugene Bradley International Airport.
Yeah, I do have to say that I think the listeners should realize that going out on the runway of an airport in post 9/11 times is a very, very different experience. There's a huge background check and special credentialing and escorts, and it was very kind of the security services and the Department of Homeland Security to work with us to allow us out there, especially the time that I was there. They were phenomenal in working with us to help us kind of re-explore that second part of that mystery, that second person who gave us a slightly different take on where the plane crash may have occurred.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, and we have to say that we had so much cooperation from so many groups and agencies that everybody really was taken by the project, and we had a lot of support. It was nice to see.
And I know, every now and then there's a little tinkling of maybe we should change the name of Bradley, and my hope is that it remains named after Eugene Bradley in honor of the sacrifice that he did make for his country.
Right.
I know that it's kind of distant from that time period, and a lot of us don't remember him. But it's important, I think, that these sites continue to be named and these people continue to be remembered.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. There has been many recent attempts to rename the airport Hartford Springfield Airport geographically because nobody knows where Bradley is. So there's been many attempts to make it more accessible by geography, but I couldn't agree with you more. It's called Bradley for a very special reason, and that should be commemorated.
Now, Nick, I know that the metal detectors did find some other pieces of metal that were kind of leaning towards aircraft parts, but again, I think you said there was no way to determine that those would have been from the type of aircraft that Eugene was flying?
Yeah, that's true. We did get some fragments, and we were working with the New England Air Museum and all of the people there and who really know airplanes, the amazing group of men and women that volunteered and worked there. Yeah, the pieces were just not enough to be able to identify. Now, we do have some artifacts from Eugene Bradley's crash because some of the people that in the area, the farmers, they were so curious. They came to the crash, and they were, pulled off by the military security as they worked the site. But the plane was, taken up, put on a flatbed, and drove to another part of the airport and kind of dumped there the wreckage. And people went through it and actually, got souvenirs, if you will. And so we do have some artifacts that have been given back to the Air Museum from people in the area that lived in the area. So we do have but nothing that we recovered in an archaeological context or working with the metal detectors that we could actually sink our teeth in and say, yes, definitely. I did hear another story when we were working this about the runway, the expansion of the runway. And there was a story that went on that when they were doing the construction of the expansion of the runway in 1961, that they did find airplane parts out in the field, including a tire and some of the landing gear. So we can't verify those stories, but those were told to us during the excavation. And if so, it might have been well in that area that we got the Jeep ground-penetrating radar hit.
I think maybe some of the people listening are thinking, well, World War II, that's not really old enough to be archaeology, is it? I mean, I think most of us, when we think of archaeology, are thinking, hundreds of years ago or centuries or ago. But here we are, 1941 doesn't seem that long ago. Sarah, do you or Nick want to talk about kind of what we're looking for in an archaeological site? What makes a site an archaeological site?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the standard now is usually 50 years, and we're coming up on 75 from the end of World War II now. We're certainly within the realm of archaeological sites as we tend to think of them in terms of that 50-year marker. And, I think that it's true. A lot of people don't really think of things that happened in the 20th century or things that have happened within the lifetimes of people who are still alive as potentially archaeological. But, we're getting to a point where, in terms of military sites, things related to World War II and the Cold War, and even going back to the Korea and soon, Vietnam War areas are going to be within the realm of archaeology.
Yeah, even the civil rights movement at this point is, in that time frame.
Yeah,
that's pretty scary stuff for a guy like me because, 50 years old or more is not, I'm eligible, actually, for the National Register of Historic Places if anybody wants to nominate me. But I always wondered if, it'll get to the point where we're actually older than the artifacts we dig up, It's pretty scary stuff, I'll tell you.
So I think that a good lead-in to talking about the Hellcat site in Preston is what you were talking about a little while ago, Nick, with people having come and, taken some pieces of the aircraft from the Bradley crash, and I'm assuming other crashes at the airfield as well as souvenirs. The Hellcat sites in Preston are now state archaeological preserves, these two plane crashes. And for that reason, over the years, people had gone to those sites and taken bits and pieces as souvenirs. And once they were investigated archaeologically, around the same time as you were doing the Bradley work in the early 2000s, the state decided to make them state archaeological preserves to protect them as kind of permanent memorials and to protect them from future kind of looting and aviation enthusiasts taking bits and pieces. So maybe we can talk a little bit about those sites now?
Sure. That the Hellcat crash site is another very significant aviation archaeological site in the state of Connecticut. And it also involves a tragic accident of two pilots giving their life in training. The two individuals were Ensign George Krause and Merle Longnecker, and they were flying Grumman F6F Hellcats, which was a very popular airplane toward the end of the war because of they could mount the machine guns, and they had a lot of versatility, and they were designed specifically as an aircraft carrier plane. That is, their wings could fold up so that They could be in a hangar of a aircraft carrier in safe space, and they also were designed with hooks to catch cables on the carrier. So these were kind of new technology at the time, and these were very important planes in the Battle of the Pacific. So what ended up happening was that on October 19th, 1944, getting toward the end of the war, Krause and Longnecker were doing training, Top Gun dogfights, much like Mears and Bradley were doing with different kind of planes. They came out of Charleston, Rhode Island, the naval airfield there, and they were flying at night. And Bradley's was during the morning, but they were flying at night. And what they were doing was not only doing Top Gun dogfight training, but they were also testing a new night radar, which was coming into effect toward the end of the Second World War, which would be very important in locating Japanese planes in the Pacific at night and their ships. So this was a very important new technology, and they were kind of testing this along with doing their training. Well, on the night of October 19th, 1944, it was a clear night, but there was no moon or anything. So it was kind of a darkened sky. And they went up, and they were about 6,000 feet going through eastern Connecticut and western Rhode Island. And Longnecker, in their dogfights, came up behind Krause, much like Mears did with Bradley. And this time he signals, he yells into his radio, "Okay, splash," meaning I just shot you down. And they were going to do the same thing, proceed upward to a higher altitude to continue their training. Well, we don't know exactly what happened, but we think that Longnecker in the pursuit plane miscalculated Krause's the speed of Krause's plane ahead of him, and it ended up that they may have clipped their wings while in flight, and one spiraled down to the right, the other went to the left, and this was not a plunge, but going into the side of the hills and into a wetland, crashing, and that kind of a crash leaves a debris field. So unlike Bradley that came in straight down, the debris field is very small. These were coming through the woods, crashing the plane as it was coming into the ground, and so the debris field of materials left behind was far more extensive. In this case, there was a fireball, and naval personnel from the Groton base soon came up and removed the bodies that were, unfortunately, they both had died, and took them to Rhode Island, and kind of decided that there wasn't a lot of value in saving the wreckage. The planes were totaled. So they actually buried them, what was left in many cases. They dug a trench and put a lot of the material into the trench, basically buried the planes as well as they could. But there was, in fact, a large debris field. And I remember, and this is what was the Norwich State Hospital property, back up into the woods, and I was brought out there many, many years ago to see the crash sites, and you could still at that time see portions of the planes still on the surface. And when we saw this, and just like Sarah was talking about, at that point there had already been people coming out taking souvenirs, if you will, of some of the plane parts and so forth. And that's when we started talking with the State Historic Preservation Office, the Norwich State Hospital and others, that this was too significant of a site. It's a memorial, and it needed to be preserved. that's when we started moving forward with the State Archaeological Preserve. And at that time, the Public Archaeology Survey team came on board to do a complete survey of the Norwich Hospital property with the idea that the state of Connecticut was going to sell the property. So we wanted a good understanding of all the cultural resources that were there. And of course, this was a very significant cultural resource, and with their work, able to document enough to get it on as one of the state's archaeological preserves. So there are penalties for anyone to go out there and desecrate or remove material from that site. It is preserved and it needs to be maintained. But it's a significant site. And one of the things the Public Archaeology Survey team did is they worked with metal detectors and went out there and did a whole scan of the area. And based on the metal detecting, which was really kind of interesting, the way the metal detector works, it gets the hit of the aluminum. You could set it for aluminum, iron, and so forth. And sweeping it, you could see where you got hits, beeping, and then all of a sudden it would come to an end, and they would move off, and you could actually determine the boundary. You could actually see the boundary of the debris field, and they mapped it out using global positioning, and so we now have a map, even for materials that are no longer on the surface but are underneath the ground. We have the hits for those. We did not dig them. We did not, they did not remove anything, but recorded and mapped. So we have a complete record. But the metal detecting survey of the debris field was, I thought, just worked so extraordinarily well. So we know exactly the extent of, and you could calculate based on that debris field how the planes came in. The trail leading in. It could be documented by material culture and the proper mapping. So extremely important and significant site, and we're glad that it's an archaeological preserve.
Yeah, definitely. And just this past fall, in October of 2019, is the 75th anniversary of the accident, and there was a ceremony in Preston, and the Norwich Area Veterans Council placed permanent markers at the crash site to commemorate the 75th anniversary. So they do stand as important memorials to these young men who gave their lives in training.
So, a little bit of personal history. I served on an aircraft carrier between 1968 and 72. I was a signalman on an aircraft carrier. So when I was out there looking at these plane wreckages and seeing the hooks and other factors, that I recognized that when I was serving, it really had a personal effect on me, and that's the thing about archaeology. I think at times it's not obscured from our own lives, and so this particular crash had some personal meaning to me.
Well, I think we probably have time to talk about more if you want to talk a little bit about the Thorson crash in Norfolk.
Yeah, that's another World War II plane crash that occurred in Connecticut, actually in Norfolk, Connecticut, as you mentioned. This was the flight of Lieutenant Daniel Thorson. He left Mitchell Field in Long Island, on Hampstead Road, Long Island, on March 30th, 1943. And what he was doing was he was part of a group that were bringing planes up the Bradley Field. So they were ferrying planes and dropping them off and then getting rides back and so forth. So the planes were going from Mitchell Field to Bradley Field, which is normally about a 30-minute air flight at that time. And what happened when Lieutenant Thorson got airborne, a terrible storm developed with fog and sleet, and he never arrived. He never arrived at Bradley, and nobody knew exactly at that point what had happened. That was a very severe storm, and over like a dozen planes got lost or had trouble in New England on that night. So it was a terrible night for flying, and it never shows up. So they started an investigation to try to figure out where, if the plane went down, where it might have gone down. And what ended up happening is about 3 weeks later, some Yale students from the Yale School of Forestry were up at what today we call the Great Mountain Trail and Forest up in Norfolk, Connecticut. They were doing some surveying as part of their studies. Yale, by the way, Yale University owns and did own even more, literally hundreds, if not thousands, of acres of forest land in Connecticut that they trained foresters for decades here. So this was part of, at that time, part of the Yale track, and the Yale students were out there. Well, what ended up happening was while they were out there, they were also adjacent to an estate of a guy by the name of Childs. And they were surveying over mountainous territory, and they hit wreckage. They found wreckage, and they reported it back, found that there was a body there, and they came back, reported it. The military got word. They went out there. And so what it turns out that Thorson might have decided, because that's all, Norfolk's a good way from Bradley, and certainly not between Mitchell Field and Bradley Field. But what they think is that because of the storm, he may have gone to the west to try to avoid the storm and maybe come up the Hudson River Valley and then cut eastward through northern Connecticut to get to Bradley Airport. And whether he miscalculated the height of that mountainous area or because of the weather conditions lost control, nobody knows. But he did go in, and again, this was similar to the Hellcat plane crash in Norwich, where he came into the side of the mountain. And when I was told about it and asked to come out and look at it, we went out there. Roger Thompson, the president of the Friends Group at the time, went out with me, and way back in the woods today, if you take one of their trails, the trail will come to a clearing, mile or so, 2 miles into the woods, if not more, and it comes to a clearing. And in that clearing, there's a monument. There's a granite monument standing upright. And you go to it, and it tells the story of Lieutenant Daniel Thorson and the plane crash. The monument is about 100 feet or so or more from where the actual crash occurred. But there are still airplane parts out there. His body was taken by the military away, but the plane crash, for the most part, is still out there. It's not on the trail system. You really have to know where it is to actually get to it. But the monument is easily accessible. That tells the story of Thorson and so forth. So, again, kind of in training, he was ferrying planes from one military base to another. And, of course, at that time, heat and fog and weather conditions were so hazardous that he ended up flying. He was flying in an eastern direction, so he was coming toward Bradley. But, again, whether he miscalculated or the storm brought him down, he went into the side of the mountain. So that is still there. And that, again, is commemorated for Lieutenant Thorson.
Well, it's hard to imagine these situations and what they must have been like, especially, all of these guys were so young, all of them in their 20s, but, prior to these accidents, they'd all logged hundreds of hours of flying time and were really pretty experienced pilots, and it just goes to show you, the risk that people were taking in service to their country and just how dangerous it was, even to retraining. And I think that it's really important that we can commemorate these places and keep the memories of these places alive.
Yeah, I think it's important that these stories continue to get told, right? I mean, to me, that's one of the most important aspects of archaeology is telling the story about people. And here's a story that really isn't that old. I mean, less than 100 years. And again, like I said at the beginning of the show, how many people are aware that these things have happened here in the state of Connecticut? How many people are aware that Bradley International Airport is a memorial to Eugene Bradley?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that a lot of people really are. I think that a lot of this history is kind of lost, and it's great that we can continue to tell these stories. And I think that archaeology often people kind of get caught up in the stuff and the material. But what it's really about, for most archaeologists, I think, is the story, is telling the stories.
Yeah.
And every site has one.
And all of these sites have a kind of an archaeological footprint that helps us as researchers to, reconstruct the stories. If we didn't have the historical record, we could still understand something about the nature of those crashes and what happened based on the archaeological remnant. Not only the material culture of the plains themselves, but the impact in the area of the soil and so forth that is part of it. So, I think archaeology has a really important role to play in these kinds of sites to commemorate and document what happened.
Hey, Nick, first of all, thank you for your service, and also for our listeners who so enjoy your stories. I think many of them might be wondering, when's the next book coming out?
Actually, we're getting pretty close to writing the next book. We're finishing it up hopefully this summer, and it'll be out in the fall. And it's going to be called "And the Tomb Remained," taken from a Thomas Hardy poem. Basically, what I'm going to be doing is writing a book with Oxbow Press in England, and it's going to be on 5 tomb projects that I probably, infamously, I've been in more tombs probably than anyone, and so it's going to be the archaeology and the forensics of some of the tomb projects. A couple of those projects were because of vandalism of the tombs, because of satanic cult and other issues. They stole bones for their rituals, and we were involved with state and local police on those investigations. And others were simply because of restorations, and families actually asked if I could identify their ancestors forensically because of the fact that there were no records as to who were buried in there. So anyhow, so the next book is going to be on tombs.
I'm looking forward
Maybe
to it.
we'll have to have you on the show when it comes out.
Exactly.
Tomb archaeology.
The good Halloween stories. There you go.
Right.
Yes. Throw it in with the vampires and tombs, and you're all set around Halloween. You've cornered the market.
We have our October show.
That's right.
Hey, can we go around the virtual roundtable and people find out how they can follow, and just keep in touch with each one of you? I mean, Nick, can you launch? How can people? Do you have Facebook, or are there places that people can go? And then Scott, if we can learn more about FOSA.
Sure. Go ahead, Nick.
Well, just to say that, you go to the website of the Friends of the Office of State Archaeology, they still list me, any of talks that we're giving. Of course, that's kind of cut down with, the COVID, but we are doing some Zoom presentations that people will have access to and so forth. So I don't have a website of my own or anything, but just go to the Friends group. They document what Sarah and even I, as a former state archaeologist, have done and will be doing. So hopefully people can tag on board for those.
Yeah, and for FOSA, we do have a website. It's fosa-ct.org, and we have a lot of information there. We are also on Facebook, and if you type in Friends Connecticut Archaeology, we'll pop up. There's several Friends groups in different states, but that'll bring you to us. And I want to, normally we're out in the field and we're getting people out and getting them involved in archaeology. Again, with the COVID crisis, things are a little slower, but we're hopeful that we'll have some projects by the end of the summer that we can get people out and get them in the field and teach them a little bit about how to do archaeology.
Yeah, that would be great. And Office of State Archaeology has a webpage through UConn. It's osa.uconn.edu. There's a little bit of information on there about the services that we provide and some of our activities. And hoping to start in the next month or so to have kind of a weekly blog post on just some kind of aspect of archaeology in the state of Connecticut, past, present, just kind of revisiting some of the really interesting sites and projects I've done, and also to showcase some work coming up. And I'm working on compiling some entries for that. We can start that running on a weekly basis pretty soon.
In the spirit of, and only appropriate in today's kind of pandemic landscape, in the spirit of everything is somehow connected, pull on one string, you pull on others. In this month's edition of Florence Griswold Museum Update, we learned that there was an archaeological dig in the late 90s on the campus of the Florence Griswold Museum. And they actually found the one of the cabins for one of the primary artists of the colony, and I think the big find outside of paints and artistry tools were a quite a robust collection of adult beverage bottles.
I don't think that's exclusive to artists. We found those on a number of sites.
Those excavations were conducted by Dr. Harold Julie from Connecticut College, and he had his students and field crews out there for, I think he did more than 1 year, but you're absolutely right. Harold, rest his soul, he also worked at Mystic Seaport and did excavations there that were open to the public. The tourists that he was actually working on when they were touring the area. So, yeah, it brings back memories of Harold, and that was a really good dig.
Well, we love hanging out with you guys on a monthly basis. So appreciate it. I can't believe that we're 16 some episodes into this arc, and it's always a pleasure hanging out with such smart people and great storytellers. And we thank you so much for being part of ICRV Radio.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.